Er zijn 3 dingen in het leven van een kunstenaar. Ten eerste, te kunnen werken. Ten tweede, goed te kunnen werken. En ten derde, de grootst mogelijke weerklank bij zijn publiek te vinden.
Who's afraid of art? Tyrants and wannabe tyrants, so it seems.
Artist Alexandra Skochelenko has been sentenced to 7 years in prison by St. Petersburg's invasion, spreading false information, disinformation.
With autocracy growing, with tyrants on the roll, Balie brings together over 40 international artists, writers and thinkers during Forum on European Culture. We celebrate the subversive power of art and literature and curate works of opposition that preserve the histories autocrats want to erase and imagine the futures they fear.
So my question is, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
Art against the tyrants. Not for the faint-hearted.
Good morning, welcome everyone to the Balie. Welcome on this glorious Saturday morning. And I think when I hear the phrase "not for the faint-hearted," maybe not my favorite phrase out of the film, but I think about Nikita Kravtsov's Jesus Behind Me. If you have any questions about Jesus Behind Me, you can go to the front where Nikita is actually working on some art pieces and they will be hanging around the building for the entire afternoon. But if you're looking for answers here, I don't have them. What I can tell about this art piece is that there's comments on there from displaced people all around the world, refugees who have spoken on this forum in the last couple of days. And that is actually quite related to what we're doing here this morning. We're talking about people on the move and how we treat them. We're talking about climate, food and migration, but I think on a much more fundamental level, and I hope you can agree with me, we're talking this morning about how we can be human in the future. I think it's one of the most fundamental questions we ask during this festival, Art Against the Tyrants, because I feel we all know who these tyrants are. Power-hungry individuals that are scapegoating migrants all around the world to alarming success. I think the war against migrants in a way has become a very successful business model in Europe. And I think we've invited people here, extraordinary people over the last couple of days, to challenge dominant narratives with art, with public discourse. And I'm very happy that Gaia Vince has taken up the invitation to come and do the same here this morning. I think it's a very logical fit because I feel that much of the response to these power-hungry tyrants has been future fright, a sort of almost ceased to look forward the progressive movement. And I think that's understandable because climate change, biodiversity loss, growing inequality, genocide, regime change, the prospects of lots of human beings on the move, it's not really something to look forward to. And all that without a plan, so that's quite overwhelming. But I think now, and I say this a lot, more than ever, I think we need the courage to imagine a future that is open, that is human, and that is forward-looking. And I think Gaia Vince with Nomad Century is one of the few intellectuals who has really tried to do this, talking about how what climate change will do to our cities, to our fields of agriculture, to our societies, and how actually the mass movement of people is not a problem, but a very rational response to the climate crisis, which I find really refreshing. So we do need new alliances, new ideas, and I think for me that starts this morning with listening to Gaia Vince. I will introduce her properly for you because we're going to listen to her in a bit. I already held the book up, Nomad Century, Eeuw van de Nomaden, and if you think Gaia is also capable of writing in Dutch, you might be surprised, but the translator I think is in the room. So thank you very much. But writing in English, I must say, Gaia remains one of the finest science writers of our time. A researcher of the Anthropocene, a global strategist, a speaker, a traveler. The tyrants are on the move. Researching connections between not only human systems, but also planetary systems. Her book includes Adventures in the Anthropocene and Nomad Century, and they are both very clear and very urgent. She's a former editor of Nature and New Scientist and regularly contributes to The Guardian and the BBC. And I'm very honored to say that the floor is entirely hers. Welcome, Gaia.
Dankjewel. So good morning,
you do speak
everyone.
Dutch?
It's fluently, but today I'm going to be speaking in English. It's a great pleasure to be in beautiful Amsterdam today. And yes, this book, which is out in Dutch, I'm very, very pleased to see. Thank you so much to my translator and, of course, to my publishers for bringing this book out, because to read it in your own language is very, very important, because you get a different kind of understanding, however well you speak English. And I know, of course, you speak brilliant English in the Netherlands. So it is a book of solutions, but I'm going to talk now about where we really are and what we can expect, honestly, over the coming... okay, so I might need some help.
Yeah, I think technicians, would you be able to put the PowerPoint slides on the side beamer here, so then Gaia can see what she's showing us?
Is it there? Yeah. Oh shit. Okay, sorry. Okay, what have I done?
See, this is what happens if you do a program in the Balie in the morning.
I was so confident that I would.
Yeah, same.
If I move here, if there is. Maybe they're having coffee. I don't blame them. It's a lovely day for it.
Technicians, is it possible to put the PowerPoint on the side beamers?
Coming up.
Coming up.
Coming up. This is your on-hold music.
We don't have any waiting music in the morning.
Okay, just so that I can also see what I'm talking about.
Ha.
Okay, perfect. Oh, I love the colors, very vivid. Okay, so where are we now? We've spent a year above 1.5 above the pre-industrial average. And if you remember, this was leaders globally agreed that we were going to do our best to keep below that by the end of the century. Well, we're quarter of a way through the century now, and this is where we find ourselves. And the temperature is only rising. And this is how we started our year. This was January in the Northern Hemisphere, and wildfires in the most expensive properties in the world, the most expensive real estate, which is why, of course, we saw it all over our newspapers and social media, because fires are going on all the time around the world. In fact, last year had the biggest spike in wildfires, and most of those you won't have heard of because they were in places like Angola, Congo, as well as the northern boreal forests and places like that. And so we had some climate refugees who were also in the news, and these are different sorts of climate refugees. And before you weep too much for this poor lady, luckily she had another home to go to. But there are plenty of people who are much poorer in LA who are still homeless and still trying to find somewhere to live. This is, of course, this is Bangladesh, and this is how many people are already living. They're living in what was once temporary housing because of flooding, which has now become permanent because people are now permanently displaced and they haven't got anywhere to go. And these are multiply displaced people who have moved often from one town or village to a city. And then from there, they move to another city because of various disasters. And so they find themselves living. When I first visited Khulna in Bangladesh, people were showing me their flooded homes and that they slept on the road because they're built up. The bunds are built up, as you know, in the Netherlands, very familiar with this concept of living below sea level. The roads are quite often the safest place to live. And so they would live there for a few weeks until the water subsided. They're now living there permanently just because it's just too dangerous and it's too expensive to lose what little they have. But we're seeing this everywhere. We're now familiar with a picture of cars floating down roads. You know, this is, again, the rich world. This is the US, the world's richest country. Constantly now, there is a part of the US which is being hit by a climate disaster, and these are extremely expensive. And yeah, we'll talk about the responses to this, but currently the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has been cut. People are effectively forbidden from mentioning climate change in any official documents, as though by not talking about it, it will go away. And that doesn't work. It doesn't work with COVID. It doesn't work with avian flu. It doesn't work with climate change. It's still there because these are real things. And the language that we use, the way we discuss these things, these are invented human ways. They're not real. They are the way our culture responds to something that is real. So you can't make the real thing go away by discussing it or not discussing it in a different way. This is Balentia. Again, cars were not designed to float down rivers. And yet this is so normal now. Pretty much every week there is an image, if we get shown it, from cars floating down streets in the Philippines, in Europe, in India, different places. This is Australia, where a lot of my family live. They had unbearable heat and fires, followed by flooding. So people, again, in rich and poor worlds are being multiply displaced. Emilia-Romagna, the richest part of Italy. Again, cars floating down streets. And what we're seeing is these cascading events. So a good example of, this is Germany actually, but a good example of that is what happened in Pakistan, where you had months of unbearable heat. Actually, they're experiencing it now. Large parts of Asia are experiencing temperatures above 45 degrees. And then there was a terrible drought, which affects food harvests, which puts up prices. We see that in our cost of living crisis here, but in large parts of the world, from Sudan to Mali, there is actual hunger, and in some places we can see beginnings of famine. And then, you know, because the hotter air evaporates more moisture, but hotter air also holds 7% more moisture. So when you get that precipitation, it doesn't come as, you know, light relieving rain. It comes as a deluge, which washes away the topsoil, which then causes terrible floods. You lose that very fertile topsoil that your harvest depends on. You also lose enormous amounts of infrastructure, and you lose vital infrastructure, roads, bridges, and so on. So it makes rebuilding so much harder. It makes it much more expensive. It makes recovery from these disasters, you know, getting food in, getting supplies in, getting help, very, very difficult. So landslides become very familiar. So we are now experiencing, this is Australia in their winter. We're now experiencing regularly these, what I call the 4 horsemen of the Anthropocene. And these are the disaster categories which actually force people, they make places unlivable, and they are fire, flood, heat, and drought. And if you look at a map, you can see already the places that are most impacted. We've been concentrating mainly on the rich world, but of course it is the tropical belt which is worst hit. And we're now living in the post-climate changed world. Climate change isn't something for the future that we haven't experienced yet. Our climate has already changed. The nice Mediterranean climate, which people used to go for holidays, is now a disaster zone of extreme heat, of people needing to be evacuated in small boats from islands in Greece to be helped and welcomed by mainlanders, because fortunately they were holidaymakers with European passports. But of course, that isn't how the majority of people are experiencing these climate disasters. This spike that I was talking about was fires in Angola and Congo, but we are seeing it everywhere, and we are seeing these disasters costing enormous amounts of money now. And this is money that could be spent on development in rich and poor worlds, on healthcare, education, social services, on making sure that people have the best start in life. All of that money is being diverted to managing these disasters in the rich world. And of course, it's much more devastating in the poorest world. So climate is already extremely expensive, and everywhere will have to adapt over the coming decades to this extreme weather. Now, most places have done almost nothing towards adaptation. The Netherlands is actually an outlier in this. The Netherlands has been adapting for some time, centuries. So it is much more ahead of the game in some ways, and in some ways very far behind. For example, agricultural policy here is very retarded. It's very backward in terms of the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis, and there is enormous amounts of lobbying from food and farming organisations to keep it that way. I'm just going to roughly quickly go over some of the issues we have. So costs are extreme, and the cost of this climate disaster is embedded in literally everything. It's the cost of food, it's the cost of commodities. This is just an example of how the Panama Canal, because of drought, was only allowing a few boats to go through. It cost huge amounts to people's bills. So what can we expect over the coming decades? Well, we're currently on track for somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees by the end of the century, quite happily. There is there is a plume of uncertainty, but we are quite happily on track for that. And the reason, let's not beat around the bush, is because of enormous vested interests. There is a huge amount of power and money riding on keeping the status quo, keeping us embedded in this sickness of combustion of fossil fuels. And that is right through our societies, and it's affecting our politics in a very dramatic way, and it is slowing down our ability to move away from this addiction, and it's much more obvious in some places than others. For example, the United States and the Middle East at the moment are are being very led by this. So I spoke to scientists at the UK Met Office who are modelling these things, and I talked about these 4 horsemen of the Anthropocene, and I said, at the end of the century, tell me, what does our map look like in terms of livability? And as you can see, there is this band of increasing unlivability. We already see many places that are unlivable now, today, where farmers are working at night with head torches because it's simply too hot to do it during the day, construction workers and so on. And when they do work during the day, they quite often die of kidney failure, heart disease, stroke. We see that in Qatar. We see these are climate migrants quite often, actually, that are working in the construction industry from South Asia who've moved to the Middle East to do construction, and they're dying. So this band of unlivability stretches all the way, really, from Patagonia in the south to the Great Lakes, across most of the continent of Africa, up through southern Europe. So, Spain, parts of Spain, most of Spain is already quite like a desert. Same with parts of Portugal and Greece and Turkey and so on. The Middle East, the subcontinent of India, Australia, and so on, becomes increasingly unlivable for at least months of the year. We already have a big issue of people moving. Most climate migrants move within borders. Okay, there's a huge amount of migration already underway within borders, but increasingly people are crossing borders. And a lot of this is invisible. A lot of climate migrants don't even see themselves as climate migrants. They have many people I've spoken to who are living in cities, say in Peru, they think of themselves as urban migrants, economic migrants, and that's how they would be classed. And yet when you dig down into why they actually moved, it's a story of drought, chronic drought, that made it completely impossible to carry on their former livelihoods. It's a story of collapsing villages, depopulating, making everything harder for everybody else. The biggest issue that we face is actually when heat is combined with humidity, and that's very deadly. And we're seeing, for the first time, we're seeing deadly survivability limit temperatures in every continent now. So at 2 degrees, looking only at heat stress, this is what we see. And we're expected to pass 2 degrees within the next 5, possibly 10 years already. So these are the areas that are increasingly unlivable for parts of the year. So, this has many, many impacts. It affects our food, it affects livelihoods, it affects safety, it affects gender equality, it affects poverty, all of these issues, which, that's why climate is discussed as a threat multiplier. People who are unable to feed themselves, who don't have security, who don't have fresh water, who don't have what governments are supposed to provide, a legitimate government is supposed to provide, become very vulnerable to the promises of extremist groups who will make these promises, who will say that they will be able to feed you, they will give you security. And so we see these divisive tribal extremes everywhere from Europe to the Horn of Africa. And it's driving conflict. If we look ahead at food yields, this is a huge problem, and it's one of the reasons why we need to completely rethink our food production systems and move much further towards a mainly plant-based diet. Just because of the efficiencies, and that's just simple thermodynamics, but also because of the incredible, 95% of deforestation is caused by food production. We're seeing huge harvest loss everywhere. This is Italy. But of course, in the Horn of Africa, when I look at that picture, when I look at that photo, which was taken in near Turkana, on the borders of Ethiopia and northern Kenya, I can smell the death. It's a very visceral feeling, because when you walk around there are so many animals, carcasses that on the roads, on the paths, you can smell the death. And this has been going on now increasingly for a couple of decades. And people who have no food, who are drought-stricken, end up living quite often in camps, in refugee camps. And these are, like the Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya, for example, they're effectively prisons. So people end up imprisoned for generations. Children are born there just by virtue of our climate changing. They are imprisoned. And this is not a future for hundreds of millions of people. We have to think differently. We have to think from a more planetary perspective about what it means to be one species on this spinning planet that is heating, and think about how we act as a planetary species. This was just a study that I thought was quite interesting, which directly maps the drought in the growing season in Mesoamerica to arrivals at the US border. And it's just a very clear line. So here again is the map of at 4 degrees, what we can expect. We are expecting people to move north, but not just people, not just families. Capital, money, wealth, industry, agriculture, expertise, skills, human activity is going to move north over the coming decades. It's a completely natural response. It's a response that humans have taken when the ice sheets covered this whole area. People retreated south. When the ice retreated north, people followed. This is completely normal. We're seeing it in all sorts of animals, from disease-carrying mosquitoes to the actual tree line is moving north in the Arctic. Trees, we think of them as non-movable, and yet, of course, we are seeing vegetation increasingly moving north. This is, whether governments like it or not, already affecting populations and perceptions, affecting people's ideas of home and security and what they look for in a home. We are going to see people moving. It is underway and it is inevitable. How are we going to deal with this? How are we going to manage it? We need a completely different conversation, and we're not having that conversation openly and honestly. We're not seeing the conversation about any of these issues open and honest from our leaders at the moment. What we are seeing is a rise in populism, and a populism is a denial of complexity. It is a simplification, slogan-based. It is a way of denying real issues that we have and producing a palatable slogan-based solution. And this is really, really worrying because as I said earlier, by pretending these problems don't exist and not engaging with them, the problems do not go away. They are still there and they're still affecting us, our friends, our relations, our finances, our food supplies, everything. We can either decide whether to embrace the scientific reality, fact and honest and rational thinking, or we can go with the ideology of populism, which is a denial of these things. So when we see populist leaders, what they are doing is they are not engaging and not helping and not being honest about the climate crisis or the migration issue at all. And I think we have seen that growing. I think it's quite interesting just to have a look at time covers over the last few years. There's Greta Thunberg, heroic child who woke the world up to this crisis. Then we had Elon Musk, who has done his best as a popularizer of, he's used enormous wealth that has been concentrated in these few individuals to completely sway and manipulate the politics for all of us. And then we have Demon in Chief, who is a science denier. He's actually actively breaking down the institutions very damagingly by which we record, we measure, and we make sense of the reality of our world. He's also dehumanizing large parts of the population. And the worst is, not even that. The worst has been the response of leaders around the world. There has been a lot of indulgence. There's been a lot of sycophancy. There's been a lot of aping of his ways forward. Populism its divisions are anti-humanist. They're anti-science, but they're also they deny the humanity of people in our societies. And, where does it end? Where does it end when we have leaders putting their own nations first? It's time to step away, look at our planet, this beautiful spinning blue and green orb, and realize that we have to think the scale of the challenges we face demand that we think from a planetary perspective, and we come up with planetary responses to our species, to the biodiversity issues, to other huge crises, poverty, injustice, all of these things. We need to think much more as planetary citizens now. We cannot separate us. We are one species. There is no you and me. There is no, nobody has more right to the safe places on our planet as we make our planet less and less safe. You know, from the biological perspective, two humans from different continents are much, much more closely related than two chimpanzees either side of the Congo River. We are the same person. There are pragmatic reasons to embrace immigration. And immigrants are absolutely vital to our economies. They're vital to our economies today, but they're also vital over the coming decades. Large parts of the world's population, especially in the northern hemisphere, are having an absolute population crisis. The birth rates are crashing, and the only way to keep that social contract where the young pay for the old is through immigration. It is a huge crisis which everyone knows. All the leaders know, even if they deny it, even if they project a very anti-immigrant, hostile point of view, say Meloni. At the same time as Meloni is doing that, she is through the back door bringing in more and more migrants because they need it for the economy. We need honesty. We absolutely need honesty about this. And, you know, I just like this. In Japan, adult diapers are outselling infant ones. We need to start thinking much more honestly, and we need to raise that conversation much more honestly about the climate crisis and about the role of migration and how we make it work. I think it's really interesting what the Spanish leader is doing at the moment. He had an honest conversation last year. He said we can go along the anti-immigrant route that so many European far-right parties are, and not just far-right parties, the problem is centrists are absolutely appeasing this. We can go along that route, or we can admit that we want to grow our economy, and for that we need migrants. And how are we going to make that work? We're going to make it work through different policies. So Spain has seen the highest rate rise in GDP. The minimum wage has risen through increased immigration. It has many policies that make sure that immigrants don't come in and just get stuck in very low-paying jobs where their labour rights are abused and they're not treated well. There are a lot of policies to help people help with mobility, and it's been very successful. So I'm just going to leave you on that note. We need more honesty, and there is the beautiful cover of my book, and it's not all depressing. It is full of solutions for how we manage this. Thank you so much. Thank you, Belle.
Please, Gaia, take a seat at the table. Thank you.
I didn't speak too long, did I?
It was a bracing talk, and it totally woke me up. So I was not really looking at the time at all.
Okay.
But I think I speak for also parts of the audience. At some point, I literally saw faces on hands, looking at some of the graphs that you showed. So it was a slightly anxious feeling that it gave. But I feel that we can talk a long time about the solutions that your book offers, and we'll go into that. But I wanted to start where you left us, which was the honesty bit. And I wonder, why do you think we've seen, in response maybe even to these tyrants that you described very well, and these demagogues that you've described very well, and we all know the typecasts, why is the climate discourse, this positive story about migration, why is it disappearing from the conversation? Because it's...
Yeah, well, I think it is to do with fear. I think leaders are actually, they distrust the electorate. They see how appealing these very simple slogans and ideas. Here we are, we will other a group, and all your problems will go away because it's this group that are causing it, and they will go. Rather than confronting policy failures which have led to housing shortages, which have led to cost rises, and the complexity of geopolitics at the moment, which interweaves all sorts of things and causes prices to go up, for example. I think opposing parties, so centrist governments, for a start, a lot of this has occurred on their watch. So by talking about that, a complex message is much harder to sloganize.
Yeah.
It's much more difficult to reduce down. And it involves saying, we made some mistakes.
Becoming clear about a collective failure.
And we will address that through this and that, and it's a complex thing. We can't just do one thing and all your problems are over. So as a result, they've abandoned any attempt to do that, and instead they are sort of jumping on the back of the, oh, don't worry, we can compete with the far right and we can do exactly the same things.
We'll
vote
take
for
their
us.
business model, but then...
Yeah, and if you're going to see a band, say you want to go and see Beyonce, and you have the choice between Beyonce or a woman who's like doing Beyonce songs and dressing the same, you're going to get the ticket for Beyonce, right? No one wants the cover band.
Nobody wants the cover band, no.
So it's a way to failure. It's a way to failure. Like if you're promising the same thing, they're going to go with the original fascists, right? Rather than the, wannabe fascists.
Yeah, and why is it so difficult for the entire political movement spectrum, save the populists, to sort of fold the cards and say, okay, we've tried this, we've tried to play the cover band, we've tried to do the Beyonce songs for a while, it's not working. We're back on the solutions and we're back on the pragmatic side. Why is that so difficult, you feel?
I don't know. There are examples where people are being more honest. So Canada is another example where leaders are saying, Costa Rica is one of my favorite examples. It's currently being led by a fabulous climate scientist woman who is saying, this is the issue, these are the problems, and this is how we're going to solve it. And the public's on board with that.
Yeah, and they've done a lot of reforestation in Costa Rica.
Oh, they've completely, they're the only tropical country that has reverse deforestation and is actually reforested. And their entire economy is built on the value of nature. But not only that, not only is it just, this leader, it is actually embedded within their constitution. So the next leader that comes in has huge difficulties if they want to roll back any of these policies. And I think that's really key. And that's why I think what we need to do is move bigger than national electoral time frames. I think we need a kind of grander
planetary constitution,
planetary governance for these planetary issues, whether it's the energy transition, cutting carbon, or any of these things. So they're longer term time frames, and national governments can work out policies within that framework, but they're not able to completely go back and say, green policy, we're getting rid of our green policies or whatever.
And it's fascinating because this festival is called the Forum on European Culture, and for a while the European project, very committed to a rule-based society, very committed to a human rights-based society.
The European Union was founded on such important values, and I think they go to the heart of most people in most countries, in most places. But they're not being restated, they're not being reaffirmed.
Or quite the opposite, even. If I think about, and maybe we can talk about this for a while, the 2015 migrant crisis, the moment that for the first time
from Syria,
1 million Syrians came to European Union. The response sort of was fearful, but then again, there was Angela Merkel who said, "Wir schaffen das," and had banded together all the European nations to remind them of this European constitution, which actually, in a way, is working towards this planetary constitution. But now the gates of Fort Europe are still very deadly, and right now it's Fidesz party, Lega party, AfD party, PVV party, National Rally party, who are splintered but still defining us. How did that happen?
I do, it's horrific. But I do think also that the problem with these far-right politicians is they're very good at slogans, but they're very poor at actual governance, because it's very easy to come up with a slogan, and then quite quickly it's discovered that you can't do, you have no idea how to actually rule. And so it could go one of two ways, and I'm hoping it goes the way of a mass rejection of this nonsense.
Yeah.
And a reaffirmation of the importance of institutions, because it's through these tools that we're able to give the most people a say in how our society is formed.
Yeah, and then the true democratic ideal of not only talking together but actually solving together would have to make a big return. I think we have to talk about this when we move on. I want to talk a little bit about the four horsemen of the Anthropocene that you highlight: fire, flood, heat, drought. So maybe we do come a little bit to Jesus and the Bible now, because I feel historically.
He looks like he's kind of decomposed slightly while I was up there.
Yeah, yeah. I start to feel like he is Jesus without the miracle, sort of. But the four horsemen. I feel the painful thing about this is if history teaches us one thing, these four things: fire, flood, heat, and drought, and the Bible states this, but history books state this as well. They push people into the hands of tyrants, as opposed to into the hands.
They do, but our history also shows that none of us can solve problems alone. Mm-hmm. We have to collaborate and we have to cooperate, and we are 8 billion people on this planet, and we are absolutely interconnected. And if there's one thing that the COVID pandemic showed us, it's that one problem in one part of the world absolutely affects all of us everywhere.
And neglects borders altogether.
And neglects borders altogether, because what we're talking about is reality, Earth systems, and they don't care about your imaginary lines drawn on a map. They don't care anything for your, othering of this person or that person. They really don't, like a river in full flood doesn't stop at the Czech border and say, oh, that's Poland, I'm not going in. And it's the same with, we can see aerosols causing respiratory failure and diseases in Europe. We can see on satellite images the plumes coming from the Canadian wildfires across the huge expanse of thousands of kilometers of the Atlantic Ocean. These Earth systems are real. Mm-hmm. And, our human world, we impose upon that, but it's not real and can be changed. It's much harder to change an Earth system. And so we have to respond in a pragmatic way. And we can't do that by denying the power of the Earth systems, of floods and fires and drought. These are realities that we have to change our human world in response to.
Yeah.
It's King Canute. Do you know?
I'm not familiar.
I won't. Anyway, we are not more powerful than the oceans, as he showed like 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Right?
And the Dutch know this, obviously.
Yes, exactly. And so I think the Dutch are very, very pragmatic in this fashion, right? This huge thing in Rotterdam, all the windmills over the last 100 years, it's about geoengineering
and simply moving the sea sort of halfway across your country in order to live somewhere.
We can do that to a certain extent, but there is ultimately a problem, with doing that. And it costs an enormous amount, and you can only do it because even though the Dutch think it's full, there's actually a really small population here. Yeah. And, we have to live within our Earth systems. However we imagine our human world as divorced from nature and from the natural world, it's absolutely not. We're embedded within it. We are biology, and we are reliant on the water, the habitable temperature, on the power of the wind. All of these things are part of the foundations of what make our society. It's not the other way around.
And when I look at, I thought it was an interesting graph, because suddenly the Netherlands popped out in the adaptation regard of things. But why have we neglected the societal adaptation of dealing with climate change so much? Like the fact that there will be inhabitable zones, that the droughts, floods will do something to global food systems, that we rely very heavily now on a grain belt that is actually moving up.
It's a huge denial, because we have been quite lucky so far. We have had this lovely Holocene climate in which to build our societies and get rich and our economies. But as this is changing, have a look at the sectors of our economy that have to look at this. The insurance industry. Have a look at that, for example. There are whole swathes of the United States real estate that insurers have completely pulled out. And what does that mean, right? The very wealthy will be able to uproot and move somewhere else. Other people are stuck there, okay, because their houses are unsaleable, because they're uninsurable. They can't afford to move. How is that? We've seen it with New Orleans, and that in that case, the government stepped in. That's the biggest port on the Mississippi River, on the biggest river. That's an enormously important place, apart from its historic and cultural significance. The federal government will not be able to afford, even in the US, to underwrite industry and insurance for real estate across these places. And this is increasingly going to be a problem elsewhere. And we live in Europe, in societies which have which are based on the idea that society looks after itself, looks after the poorest, and looks after, however much we fail at these things, that's the idea.
It is in the Constitution.
Yeah.
The social rights, they do feature there still, even though
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, how are we going to respond to this? It needs planning, and it needs, we need to find ways to solve the fact that people will be too poor to afford to buy food in grocery stores, right? So how are they going to be fed? People's houses are going to be non-viable. They're not going to be insurable. Agricultural lands are going to be covered with salt water, or the
topsoil will wash away.
Exactly. All of these issues. And we're now experiencing these billion-dollar events in the US and approaching that in parts of the most expensive last year climate disaster was actually Emilia-Romagna in Italy, in northern Italy, in the heart of Europe.
Yeah.
So we're going to get that increasingly.
If that doesn't show us, then what will?
Yeah.
I think.
And we are the most able to adapt, the richest, the least impacted parts of the world.
And the most responsible.
Yeah, and the most responsible. So there is a justice thing. So people increasingly are going to move to Northern Europe because these are the places that can cope the best and supposedly have the strongest institutions to recover. So we need to start taking this seriously, absolutely.
And to become a planet with a plan, and to which is actually in the word, and to work on societal adaptation, to talk about what democracy might look like in this world that actually tackles this problem, that actually plans ahead. I wanted to give the floor to Kisa Magendane, who I've asked to write a column in response to your work. He's an independent writer, political scientist, and a social entrepreneur who is committed in the public debate and also in his writing to a Netherlands where everyone feels at home. And he explores the challenges and opportunities of our diverse society and seeks to build bridges between different worlds. And he does that by writing, leading debates, and by speaking, such as today. So welcome, Kisa, and give him a warm welcome, please.
Thank you very much, Kees, for the invitation. It's a great honor, Vaya, to engage in a conversation with you. I wrote a column, but let's assume we are in the future for this moment. I think it's helped me to actually process what we are going through related to migration. So, do you remember those days in the unstable 20s when we believed that migration was something we could prevent? Politicians, pundits, and serious thinkers told us we needed to build mental and physical walls to keep the so-called migrants from entering our territory. They claimed that we needed quotas because our European societies lacked the infrastructure and capacity to welcome more migrants. It was a world that abandoned conventions. European politicians and citizens declared international law irrelevant. What mattered was the protection of their sovereignty. Everything had to be done to prevent Europe from becoming a brown and black continent where its acclaimed native residents would become strangers and minorities in their own countries. And so it happened. Thousands of black and brown bodies attempting to enter fortress Europe, stranded in the Mediterranean. Europe, the continent I had started to call a home as Afropean, became a sophisticated killing machine, fast, invisibly, through migration management and pushbacks, then more visibly through invisible guns. Everything was put in place to ensure that those savages, as some European politicians called the migrants, could enter fortress Europe. This is how the Mediterranean became the world's busiest graveyard, a grave full of black and brown bodies, full of lost dreams. Thousands became hundreds of thousands. Before we knew it, we were speaking of millions. Civil society's organization that had once counted death at this deadliest border stopped counting. It was impossible to keep track anymore. People working in the humanitarian and human rights sectors became how do you pronounce this? Delusionists, hopeless and burned out. While Europe claims to be the backbone of democracy and human rights, its migration policy told a different story completely. Some observers believed that the European migration policy was deliberately designed as an eliminator of black and brown bodies. Some went so far as to call it genocidal. European policymakers openly discussed the demographic bomb, the so-called demographic bomb their neighbors posed to the continent's existence. Politicians openly noted that the more bodies were buried in the Mediterranean, the less the continent faced threats. With climate change looming, it was better if those attempting to move north understood what awaited them. In other words, better to die in your own community than try to cross Europe. I remember the shame and confusion I felt in those days, looking at the black and brown bodies presented as an existential danger to Europe's existence. I recognized people who looked like me. I became aware that while I wasn't born on this continent, Europe, arbitrary factors had made me a holder of a European passport, and this passport gave me opportunities that transcended the dreams of most migrants who ended up in the Mediterranean. But I also realized that shame would not save me. I decided to embrace both my new European home and the fate I shared with migrants traveling toward the same European dream I was living. This is how my shame transformed into pride. I became proud of millions of migrants who risked everything on a quest to build better futures for themselves and their loved ones. I realized these migrants, fortune seekers as they were called, were explorers, unbound by mythical borders of the nation state, who believed our shared fate was stronger than geography's tyranny. As John Washington puts it, and I quote, "Unauthorized migration, whether it's asylum seekers fleeing for their lives or the poor for better opportunity, should be understood as a radical political act. It is an individual act often driven by necessity, but it's also a subversion of a violent system." That's what he writes in his book, The Case for Open Borders. And I quote, "Today's migrants are not a threat to freedom, but much needed threats to a global system of oppression. In their movement, they are freedom fighters." This renewed vision of migration compelled me to act. I began a quest to find others who believed that we needed an alternative approach to the European migration policy. Because despite the clear physical and psychological borders surrounding Fortress Europe, the explorers and freedom fighters kept coming, day in, day after day. The Mediterranean continued swallowing millions of bodies and dreams, much to the discomfort of European citizens who felt that they now were competing with black and brown bodies. To whom did the sea actually belong? Something had to be done. Fortunately, renewed energy emerged among activists, scholars, visionary politicians who believed that the status quo was worse than any alternative future. An alternative future where migrants were welcome to build new homes and to contribute to Europe's society's well-being. This belief was strengthened as citizens noticed that despite strict migration policy maintained over the 2 decades, their well-being hadn't completely improved. The opposite was actually the case. European economies missed desperately needed human labor for revitalization. Citizens realized politicians needed different social policy benefiting all citizens rather than corporate interest. With migrant absent, politicians who had used them as scapegoats ran out of excuses. They had to explain why inequality, depression, loneliness, and other social challenges persisted. We needed answers. We needed new dreams. This is how Gaia Vince's work was rediscovered. In Nomad Century, published during the unstable 20s, she offered a clear invitation to imagination. She argued convincingly that climate upheaval obligated us as a world community to reimagine solidarity beyond traditional nation states. Migration was part of the solution. When she published this book, awareness was growing about glowing interconnectedness and shared vulnerability. Climate change made the world community aware of the shared fate, and did the specter of new pandemics, and the rise of artificial intelligence. These forces led Vance and other thinkers to argue for global answers to global challenges, including the climate upheaval. So, we actually faced two pathways. We could use climate change and other forces as dividers and accelerate existing inequality between the global north and south, or we could embrace climate upheaval as an inspiration to rebuild a new world based on common values and shared dreams. Vince's book received received acclaim in serious circles, but political translation never materialized. Electoral cycles favored presentism and short-term interventions. Migration management and ending international treaties offered more appealing framework for elected officials. But as we all know now, this was a dead end. This is why Vince's ideas became a guide for those shaping a new Europe. I joined these communities, strengthened by the conviction that I shouldn't be ashamed of migrants, but should celebrate their courage to find new homes despite all risks. But it also became clear that to welcome migrants authentically, we needed to include host communities, to listen to their needs and their fears. This is why I embraced the idea of a collective therapy. This notion complemented the concept of citizens' councils that were popular back in those days. Through collective therapy, we recognize that citizens don't only want to be informed and involved in solutions, they also want to feel seen and heard. While migration can yield positive outcomes both for newcomers and host communities, it carries a profound cost. Those who leave their home must kill a part of themselves, and those who accept newcomers must also give a part of themselves away. Ultimately, both migrant and host communities need to grieve what has been lost before they can construct something new and share together. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiza, for that wonderful history lesson from the future. Shame will not save us. I will remember that one. Gaia, can I ask you to...
Oh, that was so beautiful. Thank you so much. You know, as a writer, for me anyway, I don't speak for all writers. You write to start a conversation, to have a dialogue with a reader, to bring an idea, and to hear a response that's been that thoughtful is so beautiful, because then we're taking the next step. We can think and we can imagine and we can collaborate. And the world of 2021, the world of 2050 will not happen by accident. It will be because we have made it. And we start making it today in our heads by sharing the idea, the vision of what it could be, and convincing others of that vision. And then we come together and build it. And that's how that's how the phone was made, that's how democracy started, that's how coins, the idea of the Netherlands, all of these things were ideas shared and built. They're imaginary things that we have created as humans. And what you've done there is taken that really important kind of step in making that idea flower, and we can discuss it. I'm so grateful. Thank you.
I'm happy to hear. I think related to what you mentioned, you pointed out in the beginning, your book is a book of solutions. I mean, the analysis is quite confronting and it's scary, but what I find refreshing is indeed what I mentioned, an invitation for reimagination. So this idea, but also going beyond just a moral appealing, which the book also had, but also to go in some weeds and very technical details on, how does this new world look like?
Pragmatically even.
Yeah, so it's a combination of both, seeing the reality there, to think an alternative future, and then actually provide concrete steps to do that, so almost like a consultancy work, which I think we should be grateful for you doing this, because as a writer, I know how difficult it is. I know how easy it is to actually just observe and name the problems, and then suddenly
moral anger with it.
And then in chapter 10, you are like, I should actually provide some solutions, and mostly people end up with very vague ideas or very only recommendations. But I think what you did is actually, that's what I assume from the very beginning, thinking this is a problem and I want to write a book of solutions. But I don't know whether my observation is right.
Absolutely. There are lots of people writing about how bad everything is and what the situation is. And I wanted to say, look, we could make a better Anthropocene. It's not so great at the moment, right? There's a lot of injustice. There's a lot of people dying in the Mediterranean already. There are shortages. Our economies are faltering. We're getting all this kind of political instability because of that. And, we have polluted air, polluted waters. We have all sorts of issues. We could create something better, but what would that look like, and what then are the steps in order to get to that problem? It can seem very radical and crazy that so many people will move, and we have to create new cities and new types of industry and all of that. But actually, if you look back over the last few hundred years, that's exactly what we have done. We've had these huge migrations that have populated
very normal
these places.
Behavior.
It's very normal. What we're doing is collapsing the time frame into a shorter period because we're forced to by Earth system constraints. So it's not something that's kind of unnatural or weird.
How do we take up that suggestion that Kisa made so very eloquently, that in order to collapse that time frame, we need to set up ways in order to grieve on all sides, sort of give away what you left, leave your roots behind. You've written about this in the past, but also that to accept that there's a brave new world coming. It takes up giving up the old.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. This grief is really important to acknowledge, and it's not just grief of what's been. Every migrant carries with them different senses of home. Home is here, home is there, home, and you can feel at home in several places, but you can also feel not at home in every place. You no longer fit into any of the communities in the same way. You're always a migrant wherever you are. And there are ways of embracing that and living with it. And one of the ways for me, certainly, is to say that this idea, again, it's a very populist idea, that we have one identity that we must be loyal to, otherwise we're not true citizens or whatever, is bullshit. We all carry within us multiple identities, whether it's football team or religion or country or city or whatever. We can carry all of these. And that's complete. We do contain multitudes. It's completely
I would
normal.
say this idea is not populist enough, so it's.
Yeah, I think
we should repeat it.
I think it's really important. And also, the grief of leaving home, is something you feel when you have made a deliberate choice to move for adventure or for love or something to a new country. But when you've moved because you're forced to, because of, your home is no longer livable, because of conflict, there is this added trauma, which is, it's beyond the grief. It's this trauma which also needs dealing with and needs understanding and needs compassion. Because people arriving are not some sort of subhuman class that we can all just kind of vaguely call migrants or immigrants or the people we don't want. They are our new neighbor. They're our, the parent of our kids' friend at school, the doctor's receptionist. These are citizens. These are new citizens, as we are. And if we don't immediately understand and accept that and don't treat them as citizens and allow them to see themselves as citizens, we are only causing this kind of prolonged intergenerational trauma that lasts, to the next generation, the next generation. It's a form of apartheid within our societies.
And what do you think would work for that? Because you're originally from the Congo, and the camps we saw in Gaia were probably similar to what you saw in Tanzania, and we're talking about trauma right now. But what do you think is the best way to, in response to this ideological attack on migrants, facilitate not as a parliamentary democracy maybe, but as a societal democracy, facilitate room for trauma and to create for everyone a right to belong?
I think the way Gaia puts it, it's an interesting approach. People coming to new societies, it's changed them. I mean, when you speak about trauma, it's something I experience, living more than 20 years out of my country, not out of choice. And at some point, it will chase you. And it's something I miss. In migration debates, we tend to think on more technical approaches, on integration and
policy.
But it's, first of all, a personal journey, which, by the way, comes with a lot of positive element, as it's described in the book. Migrants are, it's a brave thing, and I think I always argue we can learn a lot from migrants. But it also comes with a cost. At the same time, the cost is also to host communities. And unfortunately, at this moment, this fear for host communities is being weaponized by politicians, because I feel that migrants, especially asylum seekers or other low-class migrants, are easy to use as a scapegoat because they don't have a voice, they don't have a political voice, so they cannot vote. So it's a very easy group to use as a scapegoat. But I think we should really create safe spaces where we really engage with host communities to actually understand where their fears is, and maybe have a conversation on their hope and perspectives. And that's something that I missed. Instead, politicians now focus on this division, but the acceptance that migration is something that changes all of us. By the way, you don't have to move your country to experience trauma, to experience alienation. I think the COVID was a good example. You go to a bed one day, you wake up the next, completely different world.
Alienating world.
I always use Moussid Hamid in his novel Exit Waste, where he tells a story of a woman who has lived her whole life in the same house. She grew up there, the parents went, the kids lived there, and the kids left. But while this woman was living in the same house, the world around her was changing. And that's how you cannot recognize yourself at some point in your neighborhoods. And Hamid...
Find yourself suddenly alienated.
Yeah, and Hamid points it very powerfully. We are all migrants through times. Time changes us. When people come to our countries, it changes us. But how do we navigate that? And I think the framework of trauma is, of course, individual. But I think we should indeed also have an honest conversation on how very big forces, including climate change, can also give people the feeling of being traumatized. Maybe we are going through a collective trauma as a world communities. Did we actually reflect on what the pandemic did to all of us? Can we understand the current instability in geopolitical order outside of the pandemic? I think we should really have these conversations, and of course, what does social media do to our brain? So I think a notion of collective trauma also invites us to actually rethink as a society, how are we having very tough conversations about themes such as climate upheaval and migration. And that's something that I miss, because both media cycles are interested in very short and clickable stories.
And political cycles.
And political cycles more interested in 4 years electoral wins, which, as we know now, undermines our ability to actually think about the long-term solutions, which are much more technical, as presented in Gaia's book.
And within this analogy, and I think it's a very interesting point that you make, a very important point I think you make about this sense of collective trauma. And I want to ask you, because I know from your experience you found it hard to find connection to your sense of anger, the emotion of anger, to actually respond to people who treated you badly and treated you poorly in the Netherlands, for example. Right now, the people who are almost ideologically saying these brown people who are drowning, they are not innocent, because this is just the system that we want to protect, and we're building a fort of Europe. Do you think it's collective trauma that is also preventing us from having a proper response to that, a proper political and democratic uprising to that? Because it is very aggressive.
I would say it's more the culture, the public spaces as we organize it are not really helping us, because the conversation in the media is not really creating this space. I mean, not everyone comes to the Balie, and we don't have public spaces, we don't meet each other. So we should really reimagine how we have public conversation. But ultimately, as a first generation migrant, I tend to be humble. I think I'm grateful for coming here. But of course, at some point you realize that you also deserve dignity, despite the fact that you left your country. But that's, I think for me, my coping mechanism was to be the nice guys, which I still have. I was speaking about host communities. I want to understand the fears, but at some point you also have needs and you deserve dignity, and that's why I always feel like stuck between two positions. I would call people who share the same fate. I think people who are afraid that they will lose everything and maybe end up voting for populist parties. I would see them as, people who I share the same fate with, because they are afraid to end up in the same situation as me as a former refugee. But on the other hand, you have people who are more like, ideological friends, more progressive or more open. And I see a discrepancy between these two groups. People who are more looking down at maybe, like in progressive circles, I see people are not really showing understanding to why people might end up voting to populist politicians. But they will tell me, but Kiza, you are welcome. So for me, it's really navigating between these two places, and it probably is a result of trauma, but I think we can learn from what doesn't break us can make us strong.
Yeah. And I feel like the Netherlands had a very big test a couple of weeks ago when suddenly citizens in Ter Apel, which is ironically a place that was internally a place of colony, so people were displaced and moved there to work in Ter Apel. It was a village of agriculture colony within the Netherlands, that they started to play for border control police suddenly and try to stop migrants at the borders of the Netherlands. This happened a couple of weeks ago.
Oh my God!
And with quite some racist,
very racist
comments within WhatsApp groups.
Yeah, about stopping brown people at the gates, basically stopping black people at the gate, and the response, even from people who uphold the classical rights in our society, was very mild and very much almost in a therapeutical hand reach, saying, we understand your frustration. So the point I want to get to is we know full well the rights, and we know full well what it takes to have human dignity. How come we let politicians get away with it? Why isn't the movement to remind politicians about the rights that we have stated and have written down much bigger? Because
maybe I think the mistake we make is to really focus on laws. I come in these progressive circles, and most time the argument is about, yeah, but this isn't the convention. This is the international law or the human rights. But people don't care, as you all know, I would say, international human right does not exist. It is a mythical stories that we created, and it's up to us to keep that myth. And some point, I think we have became lazy and think that because it is written in the law, thus we need politicians will change. Politicians have written these laws and they can change. And I think for me, it's really about how do you win? How do you I think Gaia's book, as I mentioned in my column, I hope it's popular and we should have this conversation. But the challenge is, how do you make these ideas to the bigger audience, given our media cycle and electoral cycle? I think that's the biggest challenge at this point.
And what would you say, Gaia, at this moment makes you feel hopeful about what the Netherlands...
Sure. I think there's a lot of complacency around the laws that were written, and were written for a reason, because people came together out of the trauma of war that killed millions of people and incarcerated and genocide and all of this, and ruined entire cities, and said, we can do better, right? And so they came up with these laws, and that was great. And then we've had this period of peace that Europe never had before, and a generation has forgotten that, you know, the price of peace is eternal vigilance. We've forgotten that. And so now, you know, we play these little games with the far right, not understanding how dangerous that really is. And the other issue is our media is controlled by interests that are, you know, putting people, and not just our media, our social media, you know, and it atomizes people. So we don't live within our communities where people are humans, where we're talking to a brown person, a Chinese person, a white, whatever, and they're people to us. Instead, they become just faceless things to demonize or to objectify on social media, and that's really, really dangerous. We've moved away from these, and we need to reinvigorate society right from the bottom with public spaces. They don't have to be as, you know, highbrow and beautiful as this. They can be quite simple. You know, in school halls, in churches, in mosques, in, you know, areas where people come together. And we need to start from the ground up, where we do have that dialogue that you were talking about earlier, where people can share their concerns. Because a lot of this comes from fear of the unknown. But once you've met those people and you realize it's not the unknown, actually, a lot of these fears can just fall away. They just melt, because you realize these are things we can overcome. They're adjustments. It's, you know, and we just didn't understand.
And is there something, some solution that you're right now thinking about that makes you very excited about that future, very hopeful?
There are threads. There are threads. I am excited when I see young people coming together for a better future. And I tell you what I'm very excited about is the energy transition, because this will have multiple benefits. You know, aside from pollution and all of that, it's the possibility to get cheap, affordable energy everywhere. You know, we haven't had that before. But, you know, it's not going to happen in a fair way just by chance. We have to decide that is the future we want. That is the kind of energy transition we want. And then put in the steps to make it like that.
Maybe
we
a follow-up question, because one question I struggle with is, with your book and many other ideas, how do we translate to policies? Because what you describe, to the current political reality, I mean, because what you describe, I wonder, how do you provide different arguments depending on the target group? Because I can imagine what you just mentioned about making clean energy affordable could be interesting to, let's say, more liberal politicians. Even your arguments in the book regarding migration, if framed well, it could be interesting because you also give good example of how the private sector could be involved. I feel that we miss, in migration debate, I end up in these moralistic arguments, which are right, but I miss the political translation to actually connect to some ideas and fears.
Yeah, I mean, I made a conscious decision
also thinking of
in the
Mamdani
book.
in New York right now.
Yeah, I made a conscious decision in the book actually to bring out the economic arguments and the practical arguments, because they're very well borne by data. I mean, moral arguments to me are very obvious, but they're also very subjective because people have their moral arguments
And
that
fears
are against
clouding.
mine,
Yeah.
right? They have they have their own moral arguments. So, I mean, you just have to look at the rise of Christian nationalists in the US, right? And if you think about the idea of Christianity, of loving your neighbor and all of that, I mean, it doesn't
make any sense.
It's really making quite an extension there. And it's the same with extremist religious groups and everything. They have their moral argument for doing the most abhorrent things. But I think in terms of the economic argument, it's very, very clear, and most economists would agree. In a few decades, nations in Europe will be competing for migrants. That's how difficult the economic situation is getting. And where are the migrants going to go? Well, they're going to go where they feel that they have rights and dignity, and where they feel things will be easier. And certain countries have been quite relaxed about that, like my country, because of its huge kind of colonial past and it's the strength of the English language, has always been a top destination for migrants. But are they going to choose to go somewhere else because they're treated better? And because, these are things that politicians should be really thinking about now.
Are they listening? That's what I wonder.
Yeah.
How's the reception to your ideas?
And should you wait for politicians, maybe, even?
Obviously, we need this book is a governance book. It's about governance, and it's about leadership. I don't think these mass changes and building new cities,
Energy transitions, housing.
You need
governance.
Everyone, and obviously it's about what you discussed, about people having the courage to say, this is what we are going to do, and it's not popular, but this is a reality. So definitely we need governance to do this. But that's why I wonder.
And they need to change the narrative so that it becomes popular and it becomes pragmatic. And I think city mayors have been right at the forefront of that. I think I see a lot of impressive city mayors that are really leading.
Or future mayors. I'm thinking about Mamdani in New York.
Mamdani in New York, but Anne Hidalgo, what is she, in Paris, and in London, Sadiq Khan. We have actually many in Europe and beyond, city mayors who are very progressive and who are really creating these much more habitable environments, essentially. And of course, cities is where migrants end up. Cities are where migrants are concentrated, and cities are the least hostile towards migrants because these are their neighbors and their colleagues at work, and it's normal, right? It's normal that everybody doesn't look exactly the same as you and have almost the same surname.
Do you, Kisa, have a final solution that you can throw in that is that could leave us maybe a bit heldhaftig, vastberaden en barmhartig at the end of this day?
I think the most important thing is I think the solutions that are there, we should spend really more time in really reflecting on how we are going to make, our case. And I think it's a serious problem, our current media infrastructure. I find it amazing how somehow we have agreed that we don't treat social media just as standard media, and that the conditions that we post traditional legacy media do not apply to social media. I find that amazing. So I think we really have a responsibility to reimagine a public space. And of course, part of the solution is also to think about our democracy and enable our leaders to think beyond the 4 year of electoral cycles. I think enough has been said on this point. So both elements, our democracy and our public space, I think if we reimagine this, it can provide us a framework, I think, to work toward these long-term solutions.
Yeah, I totally agree, especially on the social media. We have made this mistake, and the whole of the conversation around AI is ridiculous to me. This idea, AI will take our jobs, AI will do this, it will do that. You know, it's artificial intelligence. We are the intelligent ones that made this. This is our tool. We govern it. We decide what rules and rights and how we regulate it. So why are we all standing back and going, oh no, it's going to do that? We should be...
We've done this with a couple of man-made issues.
It's terrible. Yeah. And we did it with social media. We're doing it with the technology giants in the US. We need to stop abdicating responsibility, and we need to demand that our politicians act like politicians and actually regulate these industries for our benefit, right? We are the public. It's not 3 billionaires in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Amen to that.
Amen to that. And I think it's funny that I should conclude that it has actually been quite a good day for Jesus, who is behind us. The Bible made a feature. You mentioned Jesus just now. But I think, something else from history that pops up in my head right now is something that Stalin at some point said.
Oh, great.
He said
always good to hear from Stalin.
Our moral leader.
No, it's not a very moral sentence that he said. He said, the people who starved, well, I didn't do that because they were innocent. They were not innocent anyway. Those who starved were not innocent. And I feel this is a very similar ideology to what we are facing now with migration. And I think the more we recognize that it's actually an ideological movement that we're up against, maybe that will give the courage to speak solutions and to speak to power. And I think if you really want to have the worst nightmare of a tyrant for breakfast, you should read Gaia Vince's book, because it's full of forward-looking solutions, and it's a very big homage to humanity, to human dignity, and it is indeed full of solutions. I hope the solutions popped in here and again throughout the conversation, but I promise you the book is actually full of them. So
maybe on solutions, if
available in Dutch. It's available in Dutch.
Available in
on
Dutch. Solutions,
since we had spoken about social media, I actually developed a masterclass for professionals where with experts you will develop a policy proposal to make sure that social media does not contribute to social cohesion instead of taking us apart. It's really in line with what Gaia Vince just mentioned. So check my LinkedIn. I think it's a collective effort. We need to build this together.
A little, yeah, okay. Most welcome to bring the social back into social media. So please have a look at that. Please have a look at Gaia's book in English and in Dutch. I want to thank you both, and I will remember your words as well, Kisa, that shame alone will not save any of us, but pragmatic solutions and human dignity, they might. So thank you all. There's plenty of opportunity to have a conversation in here at the bar. Please have a look and a conversation with these wonderful authors. And I thank you all. If you have any questions about the art piece behind me, go to Nikita. He's in the front of the building. He's an excellent person. I highly recommend you meet him. And there's many artworks throughout the building to be found. So please stay around, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
All right.